April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C., 10:15 p.m. A single gunshot. A president slumps forward in his chair. John Wilkes Booth is caught within 12 days. Tried. Executed. Case closed. The most documented assassination in American history. Except for one problem. Modern forensic science keeps finding things that don't add up. The bullet, the wound, the medical response, the autopsy. Every piece of physical evidence has been re-examined, and every re-examination raises new questions. This is the forensic file on Abraham Lincoln. And why, 160 years later, we still can't say with certainty that medicine couldn't have saved him. Welcome back to The Bone Verdict. I'm your forensic narrator, and this is the channel where history's most contested deaths meet the evidence. Today's case is different from our previous files. We know who pulled the trigger. We know the weapon. We know the motive. What we don't know, what forensic scientists have been arguing about for over a century, is whether Abraham Lincoln had to die that night, or whether the medicine of 1865 killed him just as surely as John Wilkes Booth did. Let's go through the evidence, the weapon and the shot. The weapon, a Philadelphia Derringer pistol, single shot, .44 caliber, 4-inch barrel. A small gun, a close-range gun. Booth pressed it within inches of Lincoln's left ear before firing. The ball, a lead sphere, not a modern bullet, entered the skull just behind and below the left ear. It traveled diagonally upward through the brain, lodging behind the right eye socket. 7.5 inches of brain tissue traversed by a lead ball moving at approximately 400 feet per second. Major Charles Leal, a 23-year-old Army surgeon in the audience, reached Lincoln within 60 seconds of the shot. Leal's assessment was immediate. The wound was mortal. He later wrote, "I was struck by the gravity of the injury. His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover." But was he right? Or was that a 23-year-old surgeon making a judgment with the limited tools of 1865? That question is at the center of everything that follows. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House, a boarding house, because the medical consensus was that moving him to the White House would kill him faster. 12 doctors attended Lincoln over the next 9 hours.
We must act at once.
The most senior was Surgeon General Joseph Barnes. The most consequential decision he made was also the most controversial. Barnes probed the wound, repeatedly, with his finger and with unsterilized metal instruments. In 1865, germ theory was not yet accepted by the American medical establishment. Joseph Lister had published his antiseptic principles only 2 years earlier, and American surgeons largely ignored them. Every probe of Lincoln's skull introduced bacteria directly into brain tissue. Modern forensic pathologist Dr. John Latimer, who studied the Lincoln case for decades, concluded that the probing caused additional hemorrhaging and almost certainly accelerated death. Lincoln survived 9 hours. He died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. The official cause? Compression of the brain from the bullet and surrounding hemorrhage. But forensic science would later find that the story was more complicated than that. The autopsy was performed the afternoon of April 15th by Dr. Edward Curtis and Surgeon General Barnes.
Curtis later wrote a vivid account. The moment the brain was lifted from the skull cavity, the lead ball fell out and rattled on the floor. The ball was recovered. It is still preserved today at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland. A flattened sphere of lead, 7/8 of an inch in diameter. The autopsy confirmed the trajectory. Left posterior skull, diagonal path upward and forward, terminating behind the right eye. What it did not answer, what modern forensic imaging has been trying to answer ever since, is whether the wound itself was survivable with better care. The bullet missed every major blood vessel. It fractured the skull, but did not shatter it. The path of destruction was significant, but it was confined to the posterior left hemisphere. In modern trauma surgery, gunshot wounds to the posterior brain with this trajectory have survival rates depending on immediate intervention, sterile technique, and surgical decompression. None of those things existed at the Peterson house on the night of April 14th. This is where the forensic debate gets genuinely contested. In 1995, Dr. John Latimer published an analysis arguing Lincoln's wound was not survivable under any circumstances. The bullet destroyed too much critical brain tissue. In 2007, trauma surgeon Dr. Thomas Marshall and a team at the University of Michigan ran the wound data through modern neurological mapping. Their finding, the bullet's path did not necessarily destroy the brainstem or the critical structures governing respiration and cardiac function. In other words, the wound was catastrophic. But catastrophic is not always the same as instantly fatal. Dr. Warren Wabi, a neurosurgeon who published a detailed analysis in 2010, went further. He argued that with modern neurosurgical intervention, decompressive craniotomy, sterile technique, controlled ventilation, Lincoln had a theoretical chance of survival. Not a good chance, but a chance. The clearest modern parallel came in 2011. Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot through the left hemisphere of the brain at close range with a 9mm pistol. She survived, not because the wound was less severe, but because surgeons reached her within minutes, applied sterile technique, and performed immediate decompressive surgery to relieve pressure. The location of her wound and Lincoln's wound were forensically similar in several key respects. She is alive today. Lincoln had 12 doctors, and not one of them could offer what Giffords received in a Tucson emergency room 146 years later. Here is something the standard history books rarely mention. In 1962, Dr. Harold Schwartz proposed that Abraham Lincoln suffered from Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder affecting connective tissue that causes extreme height, elongated limbs, and cardiovascular complications. Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches at a time when the average American male was 5 feet 7. His arms were unusually long, his fingers were elongated. His face had the characteristic gauntness associated with the condition. Marfan syndrome also weakens the aorta. Untreated, it causes aortic aneurysm, a rupturing of the main artery from the heart, often fatal before age 50. Lincoln was 56 at the time of his assassination. Multiple cardiologists have noted that had he lived, he may have died within years from cardiac complications. In 1991, scientists at the University of Maryland attempted to extract DNA from Lincoln's hair and preserved tissue samples. held at the National Museum of Health and Medicine to test the Marfan hypothesis definitively. The project was ultimately shelved due to ethical concerns about testing presidential remains. The question remains open. Lincoln's genetic profile and what it meant for his long-term survival is still unknown. Which adds another layer to the survivability question. Booth did not act alone. That much has never been disputed. He coordinated simultaneous attacks on Lincoln at Ford's Theater, on Vice President Andrew Johnson at his hotel, and on Secretary of State William Seward at his home. Seward was stabbed and nearly killed. Johnson's would-be assassin lost his nerve and fled. 8 conspirators were tried. 4 were hanged, the others imprisoned. But forensic historians have spent decades examining whether the conspiracy went deeper, whether elements within the government, the Confederate Secret Service, or even Lincoln's own cabinet had foreknowledge. The most serious allegation, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton controlled the investigation. He controlled who entered and left the theater district that night. He controlled access to Booth's diary, 18 pages of which were found to be missing when the diary was entered into evidence at the trial. Those pages have never been recovered. In 1977, a team of forensic document examiners studied the diary at the National Archives. They confirmed the pages were removed, but could not determine when, by whom, or what they contained. There is one more detail that forensic investigators return to repeatedly. On the night of the assassination, Lincoln's personal bodyguard, John Parker, abandoned his post outside the presidential box at Ford's Theater. He left to get a drink at the saloon next door. Parker was never court-martialed, never formally disciplined. The inquiry into his absence was quietly dropped within weeks. Who made that decision and why has never been established from the documentary record. Stanton's defenders argue the missing pages and Parker's immunity mean nothing. His accusers argue they form a pattern of deliberate obstruction. Without the pages, neither side can prove their case. In 1907, a man named John St. Helen died in Enid, Oklahoma. His last words, according to witnesses, were a confession. He claimed to be John Wilkes Booth. His body was mummified and displayed for years in traveling exhibitions.
The mummy was studied by multiple forensic teams across the 20th century. In 1995, a team led by historian Nate Orlowek petitioned to exhume the body buried in Booth's family plot in Baltimore's Greenmount Cemetery to compare DNA with a known Booth relative. The petition was denied by Maryland courts. In 1998, DNA testing on museum specimens purported to contain Booth's vertebrae, removed during the official autopsy, was inconclusive due to sample degradation. The forensic record cannot definitively confirm that the man buried in Greenmount Cemetery is John Wilkes Booth. The Booth question took a new turn in 2013. A team of genealogists and forensic scientists working with Booth family descendants collected DNA samples from 3 confirmed maternal line relatives.
They submitted a formal request to exhume the Greenmount grave, not to disturb remains unnecessarily, but to extract a single tooth for mitochondrial DNA comparison. The request was denied again. Maryland courts ruled the family burial site could not be disturbed for historical research purposes. The forensic scientists noted in their published response that the same techniques used to identify victims of mass disasters and war crimes could settle this question in 48 hours. The answer exists.
It is 6 feet underground in Baltimore. And the courts have decided we don't need to know. The Lincoln assassination file is 160 years old. It is also, forensically speaking, still active. The bullet is in a museum. Lincoln's preserved tissue samples are in a museum. Hair clippings are in private collections worldwide. His blood-stained collar and cuff are on public display.
The DNA testing that could answer the Marfan question has never been authorized. The exhumation that could settle the Booth question has been blocked by courts. The medical records that could definitively assess the survivability question were partially destroyed in a War Department fire in 1877. Every forensic avenue leads to a locked door. What we know with certainty: Lincoln was shot at close range by a .44 caliber lead ball. The ball traversed his brain diagonally. He survived 9 hours under the care of 12 physicians. He died from brain compression and hemorrhage. What forensic science cannot tell us, even now, is whether better medicine, better sterile technique, or a different decision in those first 60 seconds might have changed the outcome. The most powerful man in America lay dying in a boarding house bed, and the doctors who could have saved him hadn't been born yet. One detail from this case follows me. Major Charles Leal, the 23-year-old surgeon who reached Lincoln first, kept Lincoln's airway open by repeatedly inserting his finger into the wound to relieve pressure. He did it for hours, through the night. He later said it was the only thing he could think of to do. Leal lived until 1932. He never spoke publicly about that night again. Tell me in the comments, do you think Lincoln could have survived with modern medicine, or was the wound always fatal? Case closed. I'll see you in the next file.